Hello, we are live. I hope everyone is enjoying their Thursday. What am I talking about? Enjoying their Friday. Wanted to check in really quick regarding a post that I made earlier, and just to kind of talk it through a little bit. So we're talking about generational trauma. Post that, and I gotta pin it. Okay, so excuse me. If you guys have been following me for some time, you'll know that I have a podcast called the Healing Element Podcast. And I did have a different Instagram for the podcast, and I am now integrating the podcast into the Kai Marie _LLC Instagram page. So you'll be able to find updates about what's going on with the podcast and new episodes on that channel. So that's just kind of like I guess, what is it called? When you just kind of gotta clear up the information there. So that's what's going on with that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about generational trauma and how you and I, have the ability to begin to break cycles. And when we're looking at cycles, they can look any kind of way. You could have a situation where there are people in your family, many people in your family, again, looking at generationally, where you have alcoholism, maybe you have substance use, domestic violence, sexual abuse. You see that it's like, wow, this is something that keeps popping up in our family line. And it also could be poverty, financial issues, even divorce. It's like, well, everybody in my family is divorced. Like, what's causing this? So when we see these type of patterns that show up in our family line, many times we kind of think of that as, well, that just kind of happens in my family. And a lot of times traumatic experiences, when it happens so much in a family, and especially when you see it also happening to other people that are not in your family, it then can become normalized, where you think, well, this is just normal for people to be together for a certain length of time and then divorce. Or it's normal to have a housing issue where you're constantly in a situation where maybe your family is constantly moving from trying to find a home or going through periods of homelessness, maybe living in shelters. And if you see that happening to a lot of other folks around you, it can just feel like, hey, this is part of growing up. And so if you're kind of thinking in that type of line, it could end up impacting how you're showing up in the world as an adult. It could have you maybe feeling that, there's always this fear of security. Like, at any moment, something could happen and I could lose my home. And if you're operating in your life as an adult with that type of thinking, then that could impact your relationships. That could impact your decision maybe there's a wonderful opportunity that you have career-wise, but it is a little risky, but it could work out. There could be some fear because of what the pattern was growing up, that you may not want to take that opportunity because it's like, oh my God, I could end up like what I experienced growing up. So the wonderful thing about healing and that we have as humans is that we can begin to break those cycles once we address them. So on Instagram, I made this post, and it just says, how do we begin to heal generational trauma? So before we can begin to work on healing a cycle that's been going on for a long time, and put a pin on that really quick, this is why I like to think of healing as a cycle and not something linear. It's cycles that continue to grow. You're going to go through different stages of healing where it's going to feel like, I already healed from this. Am I going through this again? Yeah, there's still lessons that you got to learn in whatever healing process that you're going through. And so that's another thing that we can definitely break down. So first, when you're looking like, listen, I recognize that in my family, X keeps happening. Like, people do not stay married, or people do not get married, or people have just not positive outcomes as it relates to finances. People in my family go to job to job to job. There's not really any stability. So once you recognize those patterns, then you want to see, well, how does this show up in my life? Does it show up in my life? And you may say, well, listen, I stay with a job. Like, that will not happen to me because I stay employed and I do not go to job to job to job. But sometimes when we grow up in those traumatic experiences, we can become hyper vigilant. And it could look like this, where you have stayed at a job and you know you need to move on because maybe it's toxic, or maybe you have grown to a period where it's like, you know what, you've outgrown this position. It is time for you to move on to something else. But because of that fear of, oh my God, I don't know, because in my family, there's this history of people that are constantly faced with unemployment, you may stay at a job because of fear of repeating the pattern that you saw growing up. So that's another way that it can show up. And of course, it can show up in relationships, this afraid to commit. Maybe there's a fear, if I commit to you, what if you abandon me? What if you leave me? If you face abandonment as a child. And maybe there's a pattern of abandonment in your family line. So in order to begin to break those cycles, you have to see first, how are different patterns showing up in my life? Do you notice that you're always seeking validation of others? Where does that come from? And we begin to start just kind of asking why. So when you maybe respond to a certain, maybe there's a certain conversation that you're having, just take a moment and think about, wow, I wonder why I responded that way. I wonder why. Just start asking yourself why. Why did I respond that way? Should I have responded differently? And it's not about being judgmental. You're just beginning to reflect on your actions. And I will say right now, we live in a society where people are very reactionary and they're not thinking and processing first. They're just acting. And so just take a moment to reflect, okay, I wonder why I do that. And when you start asking questions, the answers will appear. That is for sure. So first, kind of look back at your patterns, and you can start with areas that you're facing challenges in, or you can start in areas where it seems to be fine. And you just want to say, okay, if that's kind of working for me, that's great. If I have a negative pattern that's not working out for me, how did I develop this pattern? And what do I need to begin to make some changes? So that's the part of, and on here I have it listed, where we're first beginning to recognize the patterns, and then how the negative patterns are impacting our lives. Are we living a fulfilled life, right? Or do we have pockets of trauma in our body that we're kind of tucking away and not dealing with, and thinking that we're not dealing with it because we're showing everybody else that we're happy? And everybody else could mean people that you know, or people on Instagram and Facebook, when actually there's a lot of stuff inside that you got to start working through. And then we talked about reflecting. So once you've said, okay, I do have some patterns, these are some patterns I got to get rid of, then you then to start reflecting on how these patterns were created. Where did you learn how to respond that way or live your life that way? What happened in your life? And that just can happen through journaling. Maybe it's kind of writing some things out, and maybe that can kind of trigger your thought process as to, okay, that's where that came from. And then when we're looking at patterns, the reason why I say it's not don't look at it from a judgmental point of view, like, oh, why am I doing this? But more like, why am I doing this? Because you developed these patterns as a way to cope with whatever trauma was happening around you. So you're like, listen, I got to survive through this. So I'm developing these mechanisms to survive this. But now as an adult, you are no longer in that space, so you no longer need to do that. So you have to start making changes. But if you're still operating in that type of space, that survival mode, then that's definitely going to affect your relationships and how you are showing up in the world. And I will say this, one big part of beginning to break generational cycles, beginning to understand how the patterns of behavior that you have, how they develop in your childhood, and how they're now showing up in adulthood. And beginning to realize the people that were in your life when you were growing up, this is big. It's big and it's also tough. The people that were in your life growing up, not saying anything that they did, if there was anything traumatic that they did to you, it's not taking that away from them at all. But typically, hurt people hurt people. How many of us have heard that before? And so what I have learned on my journey is that once I began to take all these adults, right? So when I was a child, all these adults I had in my life, and some of them did inflict pain and trauma on me. And that impacted me growing up and into adulthood. But part of that process is I began to realize I had developed patterns to help protect myself and go into survival mode. As I began to heal, I was like, wow, so I'm pretty sure these adults in my life when I was a child, they had developed their own patterns to help them navigate through life because they were also traumatized. So when I'm saying that is to begin to take those adults in our lives, to take them off the pedestal and look at them as human beings with flaws and human beings with trauma, not negating anything that they did, not dismissing anything that they did. But once you begin to look at it that way, you realize that it wasn't about you. And I say that because a lot of times when we have these traumatic childhood experiences, even into adulthood, we can think, if only I did X better. If only I did this as a child. If only I did that. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't this enough. I wasn't that enough. It had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with the people that were in your life not dealing with their trauma. And let's be honest, we don't really talk about trauma. There wasn't that much talk about trauma then, like we have the conversation now. So when we're looking at our adults or other adults in our life that were in our life when we were children, beginning to take them off that pedestal, they should have known that. They were probably going through their own ish and did not know how to deal with it, didn't know how to process it, didn't have anyone to go to. And so now they're here raising another human being with a whole bunch of trauma that they have never dealt with, haven't even acknowledged. So it's important for us to remember that when we're going on our healing path, to start removing people off pedestals and see them as, wow, those are people that they had their own childhood experiences in which they probably did not talk to anybody about what they were going through. And so now, since they didn't even know they were traumatized, because when I started off this conversation, I said that a lot of times if you're growing up in a certain type of environment and everybody else is growing up in that same environment, it can seem pretty normal. If you're growing up in an environment where everybody around you is kind of dealing with homelessness or financial difficulty or food scarcity, that becomes normal. That becomes a normal thing that you're dealing with. So we have to begin to realize that though when we're on our healing journey and we're breaking cycles, that the people that maybe inflicted pain on us as children, they had their own stuff that they did not deal with. Not excusing it, but that's the truth. So that can also help us begin to look at and say, wow, so how they acted and how they treated me, it had nothing to do with me. That was their own pain and them not dealing with it. And you can think of it this way. So as you are on your healing path, as I'm on my healing path, I know when I was in a much different state than I am right now, for sure I hurt people. For sure I did things to people that made them feel sad, angry, or what have you. I inflicted pain on people because I was in pain, right? So now that I'm going through this process of healing and beginning to look at my patterns of behavior, I'm like, wow, when I said that, maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. Or maybe I shouldn't have responded that way. Maybe I should have been a little bit more compassionate. But I wasn't there at that space in my life or that cycle in my life because I didn't know. Because I was dealing with my own ish. So again, it wasn't that person. And that person that I was maybe rude to, disrespectful to, they could walk away thinking, what did I do to her? And it had nothing to do with them. So I say that because as you go through your own healing journey, you'll begin to realize that when people come into your life, and they may treat you a certain way, oftentimes, now if you did something to them, you did something, but oftentimes if they're kind of coming into your life and showing up in your life a certain way, many times it's because they're dealing with their own stuff. Now, in saying that, it does not mean that you allow people to treat you any kind of way. You definitely have to set up healthy boundaries. And this is all a part of breaking cycles. So I'll give you an example. If you grew up in a family where there was a lot of financial difficulty, you could, as an adult, either think, I gotta work, and you're just working and literally killing yourself working out of the fear of instability. Or you could be a person that's just kind of living paycheck to paycheck. So that's why it's important to look at patterns of behavior. So if you are a person that's just working really hard, working all the time to the extent that it's not healthy, then the question is, so why am I doing this? And when did I learn that I have to do this? Because we all come to this earth to have an experience, and it sure is not to just work 24/7 and not to enjoy our lives. So the question is, so why am I working so hard? So then start to reflect back, maybe journal, maybe do a vlog. Even if you do a vlog, you don't have to post and make it public. So, okay, continue with this example. So I guess I work all the time and work hard because growing up, there was so much instability. I didn't know what I was going to eat. I didn't know if rent was going to get paid. We had eviction notices. So what happened? So because you saw that growing up, a pattern was then developed of what I have to do to protect myself from that outcome. And to protect myself from that outcome means I have to work as much as possible to make sure that I do not find myself in that situation. So then you start then that cycle starts. But you may think, well, I'm breaking the cycle. I am breaking the cycle because my family is not going to end up in a situation where we're not stable. Well, if you have a family, you're not even going to see your family. You're not going to be able to spend time with your family. Now you've started a whole other cycle of possibly abandonment. So if you have a family and you're working all the time, and they can't see you, they can't spend time with you, now we're dealing with a whole other issue. So the thing is to then think back, continue with this example. Okay, growing up, it was challenging. It was hard because mom, dad could not keep a job. Now I stay with a job and I work too much and I'm exhausting myself. How do I break this? Well, what are you doing? All the work that you're doing, is that absolutely necessary? So that may mean that you go through your expenses. These are my expenses. This is how much money I have coming in. This is how much money goes in my savings. And just do like a budget, a household budget. And you can calculate and determine, is it necessary for me to work through these hours? And you may have to go and get counseling. It may be that you have to go and seek therapy. So then you go through that and look and say, okay, I really don't have to work all these hours. I'm going to slowly start to break this cycle of this belief that I live in lack. Because that's what it is. It's not that I live in abundance, but it's like this scarcity mindset. That's why I have to keep working. So maybe it's starting to cut back hours slowly. Cut back hours, plan something with the family. Cut back hours a little bit more, plan stuff with the family, or plan something for yourself. And with this, you're starting to bring balance and harmony within your body, because your body is not a machine. It's not meant to work nonstop, just going and going and going. So slowly you're starting to break that cycle. Now, because you have more time to think, because you're not constantly working and on the go, you can think of, wow, now I have more time. I'm more centered. Now maybe I can invest my money so I don't have to work as hard. Now I can guarantee you, if you grew up with instability, people were not talking about investment. So now you're breaking a cycle of working paycheck to paycheck, or I have to continue working working all these long hours. Now you're looking to investment vehicles. So how can I make my money work for me so I don't have to work all these hours? That's you changing the cycle. So now you're spending time with family. You have stability. Now not only are you providing investments that you can enjoy while you're alive, but now you're investing for your future generations. So now they know, like, wow, mom, dad, they have they have an estate that's set up, they have life insurance that's set up. And I want to say really quick, I have a group called Return of the Kings, and my husband and I, we went live last night, and we were talking about investments. And this is a group that we started that's specifically for Black men, dealing with, racism and raising a family, and just how can Black men, creating a support for Black men to become the best version of themselves. So we created that group. In that group, we were talking about investment opportunities and investment vehicles. So, if that's something you're interested in, definitely go to the Facebook group and join so you can get the information that we provide in that group. But going back to this, so you can, that's you beginning to break those cycles, break that type of thinking. That's something that you can do. If you know that certain type of diseases, diabetes, heart disease runs in the family, right? You can say, okay, how do I begin to make those changes? What's one thing I can do? Maybe start to change my diet, drink more water, maybe get someone that can help you with your exercise, getting a personal trainer. That's what I was trying to say. So maybe it's getting a personal trainer. So you can begin to break those cycles. It just takes time, and you realizing that there is a pattern of behavior. And when you realize there's a pattern of behavior, that happens when you begin to do your own self-work. So I hope that is helpful. And I definitely want to talk more about breaking these generational cycles, because so many times I hear people say, well, that runs in my family. Everybody in my family got my whole family. And I think we don't realize the power that we have to begin to change that cycle, because the changes that we begin to make then impacts the next generation. And it's not so much preaching to them about these are the changes that you need to be making, but our lives are a living example of changes that we made to start to break cycles. So hopefully that makes sense. I didn't mean to be too long-winded, but I think maybe coming back to this conversation and breaking it down a little bit further could be helpful. If you found this helpful, please leave me a message in the chat and let me know, and I will be talking more about breaking generational trauma by creating cycles of healing. And make sure you check out my podcast, the Healing Element Podcast, where I bring on experts from the wellness field, from Western medicine, to talk about how you can begin to break generational cycles of trauma and create generational cycles of healing. So you guys have a fabulous, fabulous Friday. I will be checking in with you soon. Until then, peace.